At first, David couldn't exactly tell what had ripped him from the loving caress of sleep. He had previously been sleeping in his comfortable home wrapped in a warm blanket and resting his head on a nice fluffy pillow. Annoyed, he rested his head down once again and gently let his eyes fall. It was then as he jolted upright in bed that he realized what had awoken him. Although almost drowned out in the wind that whistled a soft melody through the night, he could hear what sounded like footsteps and nails dragging across the wooden exterior of his home. Curious, David allowed the soles of his feet to plop on the warm rug beneath him. Although sleep still cooed him, he eventually dragged himself along the perimeter of his room to the window. There he drew the blinds to get a better look. The pitter-patter of rain thumped against the thin glass in a soft beat that David soon found himself humming to. Combined with the inky dark blackness of the night, his visibility was heavily impaired and he was unable to see what was making the noise. David tucked himself back into his cozy bed. When he did this, as if on cue, the noise began again, irritating David more and more by the minute. Sleep evaded him now, and he knew with the repetitive sound lingering he could not and would not sleep at all. David jerked himself out of bed in frustration and trudged to the dresser where a thick black flashlight sat. He grabbed it firmly, its handle cold as ice despite the warmth and comfort of the room. David walked through the narrow halls of his home with determination illuminating his eyes like that of a bright fire. He approached the front door of the house and grabbed his heavy trench coat that hung on the coat hanger. And with that, he twisted the doorknob and exited the warmth and comfort of his dwelling. Now he faced the chilly autumn air and the drizzling rain which pounded against his face and back. He crept down the steps that led to the front door and clicked the flashlight on, its bright yellow light penetrating the darkness. He walked around the sides of his house in search of any animal that might have been the origin of the noise. It was when he reached the rear of his home that he heard a peculiar sound from the wooded area behind him. The sound was strange yet surprisingly human. David stood frozen in attention facing the woods. The shrill cries of what sounded like a man screaming for his life came from the intimidating outline of the enormous trees in the distance. They rocked gently in the wind and beckoned him to come closer, and the foliage at the entrance of the wood didn't bode well at all. David swallowed the saliva that had gathered in his mouth and stepped towards the woods. His mind naturally alerted him of the danger he felt, yet his actions betrayed his thoughts. Slowly and steadily he approached, gathering more and more distance from his home and closer to the underbrush. He felt the sensation of rain cease as his body went numb, and yet his mind was active. He yearned to see what could have made that noise, for curiosity, or maybe for the thrill. Whatever the case, he had gathered the courage to meet the edge of the woods and peer into the endless darkness. The soaking underbrush grasped at his clothing like tiny fingers that desperately clung to every thread. His flashlight proved most ineffective as its once protective glow seemed to fade quite an exponential amount. Undeterred by this, however, David set foot inside of the wood. He had been there many times, although never at night. In the darkness, his surroundings were unfamiliar to him. With each step, a moist leaf or twig underneath his boots squished and snapped. His body shuddered with each passing minute of his aimless trek, although whether this was caused by him being afraid or cold he was uncertain of. The eeriness of being in an unfamiliar place on a night such as this has no equal. His toes curled as the wind that once violently rattled the vegetation quieted, and the rain that persistently beat against his body turned into a light drizzle. The branches softly danced in the night, caressed by the wind and sprinkling water droplets from the night sky. The soft melody of the crickets ceased. It startled David how quiet the forest had become. As unsettling as the dark was, the persistent lack of noise invoked the strongest fears lurking in a man's soul. David stood alone in the quiet of the woods with the only audible sound the soft tapping of water falling to the ground. He could hear his thoughts, the breeze, his breath, and even his heartbeat. He held no desire to move, just to stand and be still. Still as the nature surrounding him. Still as the firm oak that stood before him, an impenetrable wall of wood. And in the stillness of the night, his ears picked up a very familiar noise. It was a voice, and a very raspy, sickly one indeed. One that made David forget the silence surrounding him. A voice that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A voice that compelled him to run, but at the same time seek the origin of the noise. It was the weeping that had drawn him out of his home in the first place. Yes, the reason he was even out in the woods at all. He would have chuckled at himself upon the realization that he had forgotten why he was even out there if it weren't for how unsettled he was. The cry did indeed sound like a man crying. And yet, no man should have ever been able to make such a sound, no matter how dear the situation he was in. It was that of terror and pain, yet David could have sworn he heard slight giggles amidst the crying. David stood, for at the time that was all he felt he could do. He shuddered as the cry overcame the sound of the wind and was now all he could hear. It dragged out even further and its voice became scratchy and stressed. David wanted to retreat back to his home, perhaps call the police, maybe just go back to bed. And perhaps he would have had not the shriek stopped as abruptly as it had started. David observed his surroundings now that his eyes were more adjusted to the darkness. He turned around and began to walk back to his house. He didn't know what lurked beyond his vision, and he didn't care to learn. And with that he turned and walked at a speedy pace, uncomfortable now with his current setting. He took long strides on a seemingly endless path that would return him from the trenches of the dark to his house. He could see the rays of light seeping through the windows, welcoming him with open arms. His heart slowed along with his breathing as he approached his house, so close to where he belonged. He walked into the driveway, gravel crunching beneath his feet. He ascended the front patio steps, the wood creaking from below. He reached his hand out and grasped the cold doorknob. He was home. That's when he heard a loud thump from far behind him. David hustled inside and slammed the door shut. He locked the door and peered outside of his window towards the woods, which now appeared far more menacing than they had before. His eyes fixated on the forest line where he had heard the thump originate. He clicked his flashlight on and pointed it ahead, its bright fluorescent light illuminating the darkness. That's where he saw it. A figure, tall and dark, stood next to a tree. It wrapped its arm around the oak, resting its hand on a branch. Half of its body stayed hidden behind the tree, and the other half stood exposed. David cupped his hand over his lips, which now felt dry and parched. The two stared at each other for the longest time, never breaking their gaze. The creature then shifted its body, coming out of the tree line. It was then, by the light of the flashlight and the moon, that it was revealed. David squinted at the creature, his heart pounding in his chest, beating and screaming in fright. He had expected many things to emerge from behind the tree. Perhaps a monster, a ghost, maybe a demon from hell that came to collect his soul. Anything but this. There before him stood a man, and a man was all he was. David rubbed his eyes in disbelief, and when his eyes refocused on the man again he knew his eyes did not deceive him. There was nothing special about the man. He sported a large beard that swayed in the breeze, and possessed very long arms and legs. He was tall but slender, with only a few pieces of tattered clothes to shield him from the weather. David watched as the man sat on the ground in a crisscross fashion and rocked slowly with the wind. His lips moved as if speaking something, but David couldn't tell what he was saying. David sprinted to the kitchen and grabbed a large knife, the blade of which glimmered in the light. He also snatched his cell phone and rushed back to the window, not wanting to take his eyes off of the mysterious man lurking outside his home for too long. David's breath became exasperated, and beads of sweat methodically trickled down his forehead and onto the back of his neck. His eyes were so strained that he thought they would pop out of their sockets. The man moved from his sitting position. He uncurled his legs and pressed his fingertips on the ground, pushing himself up. He stood straight, facing towards the house, his eyes fixated on David. This is when David's head began to feel light. His surroundings dissolved before him and his eyes focused on the man outside. The sound of rain and wind were tuned out of his mind. He felt a pull, a strange feeling, one that could almost be described as a magnet attracting him, beckoning him to unlock his door and walk out. The only thing David paid any attention to now was himself, the stranger, and the thin sheet of glass serving as a viewpoint and barrier between the two. And then there was silence and stillness. The man remained unmoving, as did David, although David wasn't sure if he stayed still because of his concentration on the man or fear. And then the man outside took a step toward the house. And then another. David's eyes widened as witnessed the man creeping towards his house. The man stopped suddenly and shifted his body toward the moon, staring at it seemingly in awe. David watched as the stranger licked his lips in hunger towards the moon and opened his mouth. It was then that he howled. This sudden noise startled David out of his daze. He felt a hammering sensation pounding his head, causing him to collapse to the floor with a thud. Winded, he rubbed his head with his hand and got onto his knees, coughing and wheezing. The warm house now felt cold as his hands met the mahogany floor. He grasped the windowsill and hoisted himself up, stumbling a bit from his unexplained hangover. He regained his composure and glanced at the window. There stood the man, face pressed against the window, inches away from David's face. David could see the man now, in full detail. He was an older man with grey hair covered in filth. His eyes shone a bright silver, and he sported a curvaceous smile. His skin was wrinkly and leathery with a very strange texture. His lips pressed against the slick glass, following David's gaze. David's body began to shudder fiercely. He was absolutely terrified. Keeping his attention on the man, he slipped his hand into his pockets and pulled out his cell phone. The light that emitted from the phone's screen provided a strange feeling of comfort to David, perhaps because he could contact help. He didn't feel as in danger and hoped the strange man would get the hint that he was calling the police and leave. He clicked the phone icon and typed 911 inches. David placed the phone to his ear, relieved that he would soon be safe at last. That's when the man smirked at David. Like an igniting flame, his silver eyes looked right at David's. David returned his gaze. He could have sworn the man's eyes flickered like a candle losing its fire. The man's pupils then burned intensely. A strange feeling of unease and acceptance mixed together to form the feeling he remembered. The feeling he had experienced earlier. Did he feel plagued by comfort? 911, what's your emergency? David heard the female operator speaking to him, but it seemed to be in the back of his mind. He was far more focused on what was before him. Hello, are you there? Are you okay? How may we assist you? David tried to respond to her. He wanted to tell her what was going on. He needed help. But he just felt so safe. Yay. His voice trailed off. He couldn't explain what was wrong. He didn't even know if there was anything wrong in the first place. The man's eyes held him captive, such as a prisoner. Although he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt trapped in his own mind. Except, not in peril or discomfort. He felt safe. He observed his actions. Were they his actions? Was he in control, or was it the ominous man that controlled him? Strangely, David didn't seem to care. He felt an insurmountable trust inside of him. David moved away from the window and shuffled towards the door in a zombie-like motion. He reached for the lock. He shuffled back to the window, or was it he who was moving? The man nodded at David, and David nodded back to the man. The stranger, who to David now felt more like a long-lost friend, walked to the door. It was in his house now. David sat on the ground in a crisscross position. The man walked into the room and stood exactly opposite of David. He too sat on the floor, the same way he had before, and David was now. The man hung his head low and placed his hands on the floor. David felt a mental connection to the man as if he were a part of him. The lights dimmed to almost complete darkness for no rational explanation, but David knew the man had done it. The man was still, and appeared focused on David. He spoke not a word. He took a deep breath in and exhaled slowly. His limbs gently shook, and he took more deep breaths. David could feel the man's hot breath splash against his skin and inhaled the stench of his breath as well. The man's shaking began to become more forceful. His knees bent and his arms jerked, writhing in unnatural positions. David could hear the man's bones snap. The man's flesh began moving on its own. His deep breathing became more raspy and shallow. His flesh convulsed and thick, grimy slobber leaked from his mouth as he crashed to the floor and spasmed. His limbs contorted into strange shapes and sizes, and as David witnessed this, he smiled warmly. When he was done transforming, the only recognizable feature the man had were the silver eyes he possessed, which still sparkled like a burning star in the night sky. He was no longer a man, but something else. He was taller, his arms and legs wider. The skinny man from before now had a hefty torso and larger features. Where David and it had been eye to eye before, it was now far larger and looked down upon David. His body hair quadrupled in its amount, covering the man from head to toe. David looked in astonishment at the incredible sight. He had never seen something so beautiful, so magnificent, so ungodly. Its chest heaved with each breath. Its lips moved the same way they had when the man was outside. He repeated the same word on his lips without saying it. David studied him closely. He watched his lips move as he tried to discern what the beast was saying. David wet his lips and opened his mouth. He said what the beast had been saying all along. He now knew. Lycanthrope. Yes, David knew. Lycanthrope, werewolf, beast, a monster. The lycanthrope turned to him in hunger. It needed to feed. The wolf stepped forward toward David. It sniffed the air around him with its large nose. Its nostrils were the size of golf balls now. David knew what it was. Lycanthrope. Lycanthrope. Wolf. David flung himself back into the corner. His feeling of safety and comfort melted away and was replaced with what he had previously felt. Fear. David tripped over himself and fell to the floor, staring up at the beast. It positioned itself in front of David and stuck its tongue out like a dog yearning for a treat. The beast opened its mouth and its thick saliva ran down its cheek. It placed its strong leg on top of David, preventing him from moving. David desperately pounded his fist against the monster's leg, but to no avail. With each blow the beast looked angrier and hungrier. It lifted its foot up and smashed it into David's side, rupturing his ribs. David screamed in pain as his arms fell to his side and he faced to the heavens, now struggling to breathe. Each breath he took felt like a sharp knife stabbing into his side. His eyes welled with hot tears that ran down his face. David felt the salty taste in his mouth as well as the searing pain throughout his body. He was far outmatched by the wolf that assaulted him. The wolf bent down in front of David's face and sneered at him in victory. David stared at the wolf in hatred and spat at it, quickly causing the wolf to lose its grin. David was now the one smirking, glad he could make the wolf as unhappy as could be. With that, David leaned his head back and awaited the beast to emancipate him from life. He awaited the sharp daggers for teeth the wolf had to tear into his throat and consume him. He awaited the beast to rip him into two pieces with its enormous hands. He awaited the beast to plunge him into eternal darkness. The wolf opened its mouth and David looked up in surprise. It had no teeth. All that stood in its mouth were gums where teeth should be, but there were no teeth there. A slim black tongue like that of a snake exited the wolf's mouth. The tongue was forked and dark as char. It approached David's mouth, attempted to enter. David tightly closed his mouth shut, realizing he was still afraid of death even if he was utterly helpless. David grunted and kept his mouth shut, annoying the wolf further. The wolf curled its fist into a ball and struck David in the gut, leaving his mouth gaping ajar. The wolf's tongue entered David's mouth. David gagged as it touched the back of his throat, but the wolf forced the tongue down his throat even further. The tongue was impossible in length, as David felt it scratching the walls of his esophagus. David squirmed in discomfort, the tongue traveling further and further downward. The wolf began to inhale, its tongue acting as a makeshift straw. David felt lightheaded, yet the discomfort remained. The wolf snarled as its tongue wiggled in David's stomach. David's skin turned pale. His air was running out. David looked for a split second at the wolf's tongue. It was covered in a thick black substance that appeared to be coming from inside of David. David's eyes fluttered as he felt himself passing out from a lack of oxygen. His head fell to the floor. It was then the wolf ripped its tongue out from David's throat and stepped backward. David gasped for air, clutching his chest and trying to compose himself. As soon as he caught his breath, the wolf jumped back onto him and resumed his assault once more. A policeman arrived at a house by the woods after he was sent to investigate a strange call an operator had received earlier. The policeman entered the home, noting there was no sign of forced entry. Walking into the living room, the officer found a man slumped against a corner. A thick, chunky, black substance was spilled on the floor next to him, and the man was pale, with tear stains across his face. His eyes were wide open and he rocked back and forth in a fetal position. His expression never changed, and neither did the words he repeated in a shaky voice, eyes staring ahead unmoving, silver pupils radiating from his sockets like a burning flame. Lycanthrope. Cemeteries have somewhat of a reputation for being creepy places. Places in which our imaginations can be stimulated to a point of extreme dread. The roots of a maple tree are mistaken for the reanimated corpses of the damned, crawling desperately to the surface of the earth to wreak havoc on the living. A fine layer of mist is the soul of a long-lost lover, hopelessly trapped between two planes of existence. Shadows are cloaked and hooded vampires waiting to pounce, stone angels are conduits for demons, and a headstone outlined by the phosphorescent light of the moon is a bloodthirsty werewolf, bearing its fangs. Jax Mercer wasn't afflicted by such childish concerns. He had been around the Palestine cemetery so often that it was nigh impossible to spook him. This was still quite a wonder, however. Very few people can enter a cemetery in the middle of the night without letting a shiver or two pass down their spine, even one as utterly mundane as the Palestine cemetery. This place, in particular, was nothing special. A small collection of gravestones, some older and some new, scattered vases with the occasional rose, and, of course, the Palestine Methodist Church just down the road. However, Jax's indifference didn't stem from total bravery. He knew that the cemetery itself wasn't to be feared. The real danger lay in the surrounding woods. He was a giant of a man, standing at 6 feet, 5 inches tall. More so, he was muscular. His tattoo-laden arms were as thick as trunks from a crepe myrtle tree, and a single hand could grip and crush a watermelon without much discernible effort. 37 years of age had given his face a hard, brutal look, making his sparse stubble strangely noticeable. Not that he cared. He wasn't a man of hygiene at all. Why would he be? He had no wife to please, nor anyone to please for that matter. Except for the lark. On the night the lark called on him for the umpteenth time, he was sitting on his termite-ridden couch at home, watching a late-night John Wayne movie. He was in a fine mood. His naturally stormy countenance had taken on a look of contentment. The single red rose, the one souvenir of last month's disaster, had been cast into the fireplace not too long earlier. He wouldn't be plagued by sentiments of unnatural guilt any longer. Furthermore, Jax loved westerns. He practically worshipped actors such as Wayne, Eastwood, and Cooper. And to enlighten his mood even more, he had a woman for hire coming over at 1 a.m. Just in time for his movie to be over. Cheryl, her name was. A flirting blonde goddess of a woman. According to the Craigslist ad, anyways. Things couldn't have been going better. Then the lark called upon him. Just as it said it would so many years ago. He knew the call would come soon, but he had shoved the possibility into the back of his mind. If he had remembered, and fully realized the proximity of his hour, it would have laid wreckage to his sunny disposition. The voice of the lark penetrated his brain like a slug from a high-caliber pistol. It hurt like hell, it usually did, and in a moment's notice, he was on the ground, writhing uncontrollably. His eyes had rolled up into his head, and he saw nothing but darkness, felt nothing but the convulsions running up and down his body like liquid fire coursing through the marrow of his bones. It was only when foam was beginning to accumulate on the corners of his mouth that the lark spoke in some foreign language that Jax shouldn't have been able to understand, but did. It is time. His perfect night was ruined. Cheryl could wait until some other time. He had a very important task ahead of him. An assignment that, if left unattended, would result in the tragic deaths of hundreds of innocent people. Jax was the unsung hero of the town of Palestine. Every night, as the people of the town lay down safely in their beds, they owed it all to Jax, though they didn't know it. Jax headed out to the shed in the back, unlocked it, and stepped inside before switching on the light. The scent emanating from underneath the rotting wood was nothing short of repugnant. It appeared as if a raccoon had trapped himself in the tight space between the bottom of the shed's flooring and the uneven ground below. Jax didn't mind. He was used to the reek of festering corpses. Not from his job as the local gravedigger, but from the burden that he had been victim to for 7 years now. Scanning the shelves, he found what he was looking for: a shovel, a large heavy-duty flashlight, and a coil of rope. The first time he had made his ritualistic drive to the Palestine cemetery, he had been as nervous as a kindergartner on the first day of school. His churning stomach had been tied in several complex knots, his sweaty hands had gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his lower lip was being bit with such ferocity that it had turned white. All that had changed now. He might have been going to the supermarket for a carton of milk for all the emotion he showed. It was a short drive. No less than 5 minutes long. As soon as he passed the church, Jax turned his high beams on and pulled into the grass, rolling through the short pasture between the church and graveyard. Nobody saw him. The road was practically abandoned on every day, save for Sunday. He parked his Ford pickup as close to the graveyard as he possibly could. As soon as the deed was done, he found it was best to get back home as fast as he possibly could. No sense in walking the extra 50 yards to the road. Best to just get it over with as quickly as possible. In and out, then go home and watch Clint Eastwood waste Lee Van Cleef, all while you try not to think about what you just did. Especially after what had happened last time. The cemetery didn't scare him, but Jax shivered nonetheless as the memory permeated his mind. He shook himself, cleared his head, and grabbed the equipment out of the back of his truck. The long grass swished impatiently about his feet. He would have to cut it soon, preferably next Monday when he was well rested and fit. As the gravedigger of this establishment, it was what they paid him for. With an expert flick of Jax's thumb, the flashlight burst to life, providing a small ray of illumination which he used to look at the headstones. Henderson. He was looking for the tombstone labeled Shelley Henderson, although in reality, Shelley wasn't the one laying on the soft white fabric of the casket. The rotting remains of Shelley Henderson were now slowly dissolving in a pool of stomach acid. The beam of light danced across the cemetery until it found what it was looking for. Heading over to the grave, Jax set his flashlight down on the ground, propping it up slightly on the rope coil as to cast a ray of radiance over the area where he would be digging. He raised the shovel, then stopped. He knelt and brought the round point of the tool closer to his face. His stomach dropped about a foot. No, his eyes hadn't been deceiving him. A maroon speck that he had somehow missed was encrusted into the rusty metal. He extended a thumbnail and scratched until it was gone. With that out of the way, he stood, pushing the flat of his palm on the handle of the shovel. Jax plunged the blade deep into the earth. It slid through the soil easily, just as expected. After all, it was only a month ago that this grave had been last exhumed. Jax smiled wryly. First stab of the night. Not bad. Of course, there would be much more to come over a sustained period of 3 long hours. For the average group of 2 to 3 men, the process of exhumation would take around 5 hours. But Jax was a brute of a man on his own, and a fast worker at that. 2 hours later he was 4.5 feet into the ground and just beginning to sweat excessively. Perspiration was dripping down the bridge of his nose and giving the Roman gladiator inked into his left bicep a new slick sheen of fluid. He wiped at his brow absent-mindedly and continued. The pack of chewing tobacco that he had jammed into his lower lip was growing heavier. He spat once, letting some of the juice drip down his chin, then kept digging. He struck the concrete of the burial's vault seal no less than an hour later. Breaking in wasn't a problem. That part was done already. Within seconds, he was staring down at the black steel of the casket. He breathed in and let out a shaky breath. The hardest part of this entire operation was moments away. He had no trouble handling dead bodies. Otherwise, his job would be difficult. He did, however, have trouble working up the courage to open the lid of that casket, looking down at the face of the young boy he had murdered. That was going to be difficult. He took a moment to reminisce. It was last month, July, when he had killed the child. He hadn't wanted to, but he wasn't given much choice in the matter. On that night, an especially nasty thunderstorm was forming in the distance. The occasional flashes of heat lightning served as a natural malfunctioning lantern as he dug feverishly, beseeching the earth for the corpse of Shelley Henderson, an elderly woman who had died only last month. By midnight, the storm was upon him. The blackened clouds attacked relentlessly with bullet-shaped stinging raindrops. The deep rumble of thunder shook the air. Jax could only smile to himself. The water loosened the soil, making digging far easier than it already was. In a matter of minutes, he uncovered that same black steel casket for the first time. The grave was flooding rapidly, and already his ankles were submerged in lukewarm summer rainwater. Situating one knee on the bottom portion of the casket, he slipped his fingers under the lid and flung it open, exposing the corpse within. In the beginning, he had always had to use special tools to open the caskets, but he had since discovered that he could use his own brute strength. All in all, Mrs. Shelley Henderson didn't look that bad after a month underground. Her mouth was turned downward in a post-mortem scowl, her lips shriveled back to reveal dry yellow teeth, her white hair was beginning to fall out in thick clumps. Blistered brownish yellow skin had sunken into the bones of her wrinkled face. Worst of all, her closed eyes looked strangely empty, like bare sockets with two thin layers of rotting flesh stretched across them and sloppily sewn together. Jax felt the sick, unshakable urge to find a needle and poke one eye hole. He mused that if he did, the flesh would slide apart and off her skull entirely. She had been buried in a beautiful white dress, expensive lace, no doubt. The casket itself wasn't too shabby either. Someone had spent a lot of time and money to make sure that she would rest peacefully. Jax felt a twinge of sympathy. When his mother had died 15 years ago, he had taken measures much like this. He almost felt bad for disturbing Shelley's final resting place. Almost. Jax slid his hand under the corpse's shoulder. Like so many times before, the bare skin exposed at the back had stuck to the cloth of the lining. He pulled, gently, slowly. Ironically, he was always as delicate as he could with the bodies, despite the destruction that would eventually become of them. To his discontent, some of Shelley's skin peeled and left a slimy residue on the costly fabric. Oh well. Cradling her in his arms like an overgrown newborn, the gravedigger tugged Shelley out of her shell, lifted her, and benevolently set her down on the even ground above, next to his dirt pile. Jax was just considering how he'd have to move the body quickly when he climbed out of the grave and saw him. Ronnie Blakely. That was the kid's name, although Jax didn't know him personally, or at all, for that matter. In fact, he would only learn the name of the child later that week, when he read about his disappearance in the newspaper with trembling fingers. He was a short little guy, especially compared to Jax. The cute characteristics of childhood marred his face. Someone like Shelley Henderson probably pinched his cheeks every once in a while. Especially with those freckles and chubby facial features. His chestnut brown hair, partially obscured by the hood of his yellow rain slicker, was curly. In his hands, he carried a single red rose. A rose that Jax would eventually destroy in his fireplace. He was looking at Jax, half confused, and half frightened. His tiny green eyes kept flitting from his frozen form, one knee on solid ground, the other leg still in the hole, to the nearby body. Jax was panicking, though he didn't let it show. This wasn't supposed to happen. This couldn't happen. Not now, not a kid. Oh God. Why couldn't it have been an adult that had walked in on him? Adults could be bargained with, reasoned with, and threatened. Not a kid. All kids ever did, in Jax's experience, was talk. And from the looks of it, this particular child had quite a story to tell. And when he did tell, what would happen? Jax, certainly, would be imprisoned. And then the town of Palestine would be doomed. The child standing not 20 paces away from him could unintentionally murder hundreds. A ball of energy began to build in Jax's chest as he stared at Ronnie, who was silently sizing him up from a distance. The energy spread to his legs, his arms, his whole being. He knew what had to be done, but did he have the power to do it? A single tell spurred the chase. Ronnie's lip quivered. Slightly. Almost infinitesimally, but enough. Jax wrenched himself out of the opening in one quick motion, grabbing the shovel from its place beside the flashlight. Ronnie turned and started to run. Jax followed, feet stamping furiously into the marshy grass, his wet feet squishing against the soles of his boots. It didn't take him long to catch up, with his heightened build. They were both still running when Jax raised the shovel over his head, both still running when he brought him down, concentrating all the strength in his body on this one fatal swish. The blade of the shovel embedded itself in Ronnie's skull with a short, crisp thwack. A moment passed, and his legs were still kicking desperately, as if he was still capable of running away. A primal groan of pain escaped his lips, followed by a series of short gasps. Jax was gripping the handle of the shovel so tightly that he was sure it would burst to splinters at any moment. He tasted blood. It was his own. He was biting the inside of his cheek hard. The brassy taste mingled with remnants of tobacco. Ronnie was flailing his arms, his hands desperately reaching towards the back of his head, as if to dislodge the metal from his brain. A few thin, eerie scratches were oddly noticeable through the din of the rain as his minuscule fingernails scrabbled over the shovel's head. Suddenly, every bone in Jax's body felt drained. He lightly wrenched the shovel downwards, and it released itself from the child's head with a hiss of pressurized blood, which lightly peppered his face and arms with a veneer of warmth before the rain washed it away in rivulets that cascaded down his form and tainted the soil. He closed his eyes, only listening to the thud of the body hitting the ground. He went to his truck, got inside, and locked the door. There was a bottle of Smirnoff's in the glove compartment. Man's best friend in case of crucial decisions. It took him a long time to consider his options. He could get out right now. He could run away from Palestine and never come back. But then, no. He refused to think of the destruction that response would entail. He was a good person. Truly, he was. His mother, God bless her, had raised him better than to commit such a cowardly action. There was only one option. The right option. An hour and a half later, Shelley Henderson had been fed to the lark, and Ronnie was 6 feet underground, lying in a bed of eternal sleep. His slumber, however, would soon be broken. The lark liked fresh bodies, and he had to be running out of tombs to raid, right? That was a scary thought. Soon, he would run out of graves to dig. Jax did his best to push the thought out of his mind. He had faith in his lifetime philosophy: do what you can, while you can, and if you have a problem, wait until it presents itself instead of worrying about it. He had taken one thing from the boy. A single article to preserve some of his innocence that was otherwise wiped off the face of the earth, the single red rose. That was a month ago, Jax realized. It seemed like just last week. Like last week when the search parties were issued. Just last week when Ronnie's pitiful mock funeral was held just yards away from where his actual body resided. It was so ironic, Jax couldn't help but find it darkly funny. Jax stared down at the casket which housed the Lark's monthly meal. He breathed in, letting the cool air fill his lungs. Then, in one fast, precise motion, he bent down, hooked his fingers underneath the lid and jerked the boy's next to final resting place open. Ronnie had fared even better than Shelley Henderson. In fact, he was virtually the same as he was while he was alive, with the exception of the blood that matted his hair and the thick layer of moss that now covered his face. And of course, his exposed skin was noticeably paler, but that was to be expected. Nonetheless, Jax felt sick to his stomach. Not from the body itself, but the fact that he was the one who had caused this once living creature to lie still. Gingerly, he placed a finger on Ronnie's shoulder and pressed. The skin underneath was oddly spongy. Then, pursing his lips, he worked an arm under his back, leaned in close, and hoisted him upwards. That's when Jax caught sight of the boy's wound in the feeble ray of flashlight. His insides turned to water, and his arms began to shake involuntarily. A green oozing crust was layering the exposed cut, which was outlined by a large, ugly yellow-brown discoloration that was noticeably large even through the haziness of Ronnie's hair. It reminded Jax, ludicrously, of the bruised skin of an apple. The exposed brain matter within the cut itself might have been red toothpaste with a small stretch of the imagination. Jax bit his tongue hard to keep the vomit down and pushed the body upwards, thrusting it more roughly than required onto the ground above. The last time he had seen such gore was 3 summers ago when he had exhumed the body of a car crash victim. Physically, the walk into the woods was the easiest part. You just cradled the corpse like your one true love in your arms before setting out. The Lark had one specific place it liked to appear. And Jax reached it in less than 5 minutes. He had stopped at a clearing in the forest, with a deep incline that led into a huge abyss of mud and slime, about 50 feet across. Jax stopped, and laid the body out on the ground, in the right position for the upcoming task. He smelled the Lark before he saw it. He always did. As much as he had been around the dank stench of decomposing and even bloated cadavers, the smell of the Lark always managed to make him wrinkle his nose in disgust. It was ozone combined with warm rotted eggs and a strong touch of the sewers. The ground under Jax's feet trembled slightly. He took a step back, cautious of his surroundings. One of his biggest fears was that he would accidentally tumble down into the pit. Then, all would be lost, in more ways than one. Then, from the chasm of filth below, a low, gentle, stirring in the muck, which was starting to issue a low hum as it bubbled, gently at first, then more violently as it progressed into a full gurgle, complete with the build-up of fizz near the outer rims of the pool of sludge. A single black tentacle emerged from the slime, sleek, smooth, and shiny. The reptilian rope swished through the air like the tail of an angered lion, testing the night. Apparently, it liked what it felt, because it was soon joined by more. 10, 20, 40, Jax couldn't keep track of their number. All of them vibrated spastically, unveiling the source of the bubbling and fizzing. This was a new trick, probably an attempt at intimidation, and one that was working at that. A cool hand of reassurance touched Jax's mind. He closed his eyes and clenched his fists. It was an illusion. All an illusion created by the beast in the ground. It was that same illusion that had lured him into the woods all those years ago, forced him into that deal. A series of high, shrill-pitched clicks echoed off the trees. It was laughter. The lark was laughing at him. Jax could do nothing but swallow his pride and push the comfort to the edges of his consciousness, forcing himself to face the cruel truth of the world. There was no consolation here. He hated the lark, and the lark would destroy him without a second thought. That was all. It was several years ago when they had first met. Jax was young and naive. The lark must have known this. Must have been able to sense that such minds are easier to twist and pervert. Because now, he was on the low end of a high-stakes deal for the rest of his years. Every month, one exhumed body for the lark. And if the lark didn't get what he wanted, Palestine would be razed. How fair. Bitterly, Jax spit what remained of his tobacco. A tired sense of rage was expanding in his being, starting in his heart, and working its way throughout his veins. Jax was exhausted, plain and simple. Exhausted of giving so much to people who had given him so little. Exhausted of the constant, boring cycle that his life had become. Exhausted of knowing that there was no escape. In a single romp of pathetic and doleful fury, Jax rushed forward and kicked Ronnie's body directly in the sternum, sending him tumbling down into the void, where he was encompassed by the massive writhing tentacles. It looked like 1,000 water moccasins were crawling over the corpse, especially in the light of the moon. Within a minute, he was gone, swallowed by tentacle and muck alike. Jax's work here was done. He turned to go. Now, about those tombstones. There were very few left in the Palestine cemetery. Jax knew that. What would he do when he ran out? Surely, he could get bodies from other cemeteries? No. Moving them would be too much a chore, and anyways, few cemeteries were as isolated as Palestine's. Jax thought of the shovel. How easy it had been, murdering Ronnie. One swift, quick blow to the head. Could it be all too difficult to do that again? The rose was burned. Ashes to ashes. Dust to dust. No more guilt. Yes. He could do it again. Probably several times. As a matter of fact, once the Palestine cemetery became useless to him. If he was lucky, maybe he'd even get caught. Jacob cursed as he pushed through the thick underbrush trying to make his way to the tree stand he had built earlier in the summer. He was certain that this location would give him an optimal line of sight to the neighboring field in which he frequently saw large herds of deer. This was going to be his year, and he was sure of it. This is the year that I bring home my trophy buck, he thought, as he recalled the events of the day so far. He had awakened at 4:30 a.m. He began to prepare for a long day in the woods, on the backside of his farm. His first order of business had been to locate and rescue his gloves and camouflaged hunting gear from whatever undisclosed area of his home that his wife had hidden them. He would most assuredly need them this morning to protect him from the bitter cold November morning. How could it be this cold, this early in the year? He wondered as he started to work on his second task of the day, which was to prepare a breakfast that would stick to his ribs long into the day. He wasn't entirely sure what he wanted this morning, but he finally settled on toast, country ham, and scrambled eggs that were just a little too runny. He topped it all off with a large cup of coffee that had left a bitter aftertaste on his tongue. In fact, he could still taste it. After accomplishing tasks 1 and 2, he packed himself a bologna and cheese sandwich for lunch, grabbed his Remington 30.06 hunting rifle, a thermos of coffee, and headed out the door. He loaded his gear into his truck and pulled out of the driveway and turned right onto the one-lane blacktop road that led to the backside of his property. After about 2¼ miles he turned right again off the blacktop onto a dirt road that was gouged with deep mud-filled ruts. He had traveled about half a mile down that pitiful rut-filled excuse for a road when he came to his desired location. He got out of his truck and loaded his gun and sauntered off into the woods. Jacob had gone little more than 500 yards into the densely wooded tree line when he began to wish that he had put on an extra layer of clothing to shield him against the chilly morning air. 10 minutes out of the truck and he was already cold, and it was made worse by the cloudy overcast day, and the wind that was blowing steadily through the trees, making the autumn leaves rattle like dry bones. Oh well, he thought, it's going to be a good day anyway, especially if I bring home a big one. Jacob took about 10 more steps when an uneasy feeling began to creep over him. He felt as though someone had stepped over his grave. He got the distinct feeling that he was being watched. But by whom? This was his property, and it was posted. No one had permission to be on his land. He had to be alone, but if he was alone, why couldn't he shake this eerie feeling that was scratching at the base of his skull? Something was off today. There was a deafening silence there in the forest, no bird, or insects, only the sound of the wind in the trees. Convincing himself that it was nothing more than a case of nerves, he continued to press on until he came to a clearing not far from his tree stand. Stepping into the clearing, Jacob saw the remains of what appeared to be a large deer. He wasn't quite able to make out what he was seeing from this distance because the sun wasn't completely up yet and the forest was still enveloped in shadows. Jacob walked closer to get a better look, and found that he had been correct. It was a deer, a large 8-point buck in fact. Looking at the remains, he felt a sense of dread come over him and icy fingers danced along his spine. Something about this kill just didn't seem right. The throat was completely torn out, and the stomach was ripped open, plus several of the internal organs were missing. It was the most grisly thing he had ever seen. This definitely wasn't a coyote kill, and no hunter would have done this. They would have taken the head to have it mounted. What could have done this? He wondered. A fear like nothing he had ever experienced before began to wash over him in waves. What is going on? He thought. At nearly 225 pounds, and well over 6 foot, he wasn't one to give in to fear, but now he couldn't seem to calm down, and his heart was beating like a trip hammer. The feeling that he was being watched was getting stronger by the minute, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was moments away from a bad situation. He slowly started to back away from the mangled carcass, and head back to his truck, and back to safety. No more than 6 steps into his journey his blood turned to ice in his veins, as a deep guttural, wailing scream shattered the eerie silence, and what was left of his courage. He had grown up on the farm all his life, and had been an experienced hunter since childhood. He was familiar with every animal in this part of the state. Not even a cougar, bobcat, or bear could have produced the scream that had torn through the early morning forest and filled him with such a bone-chilling apprehension. Primal fear now gave way to stark terror as he chambered around into his 30.06, and turned around only to find there was nothing behind him. His mind raced with confusion, and he was confronted with a million thoughts at once. What should I do? What could it be? Should I run? Am I going to die? His survival sense kicking into overdrive, Jacob decided to continue on his previously contrived plan, which was go to the truck, and get out of there while the getting was good. Slowly, and cautiously he made his way toward the perceived salvation of his vehicle. silently praying every step of the way. With 300 yards separating him from his only avenue of escape, Jacob began to hear heavy footfalls off to his left. He could hear the crunching of withered leaves, sticks and debris that littered the forest floor. Summoning every ounce of courage that remained within him, he forced himself to look in that direction, and that is when he saw the dark silhouette that followed him through the densely tangled forest. Quickening his pace, he redoubled his efforts to reach the truck and get to a phone and call the sheriff, the game warden, or anyone that would listen. He couldn't tell what it was that was stalking him, but he could clearly see that it towered more than 7 feet, and was incredibly massive. Jacob couldn't help but think that he was about to become a national statistic, a person who left home under normal circumstances and just disappeared without a trace. How many people, he wondered, go into the woods and just vanish, and the authorities just assume that they have become lost, or injured, or been the victims of animal attacks, with their bodies never recovered? Please God, don't let that happen to me, he thought, as he drew closer and closer to his truck. 75 yards became 50, and 50 became 30, and 30 became 10. Like a miracle he was back and opening his door. Throwing his rifle inside, he pulled himself up into the cab, and started the engine and hit the gas, but the truck went nowhere. He had parked in a large mud puddle, and now the tires simply spun, slinging mud 30 feet behind him. Oh no, not now, he thought. I can't be stuck, not now. Allowing himself a moment to think, Jacob remembered. This truck is a 4-wheeled drive, there is no way I can be stuck. Reaching down, he locked his truck in 4-wheel drive, and was prepared to punch the gas and leave this nightmare behind. Unfortunately for Jacob, some nightmares are not so easily left behind, and there is nothing worse than a nightmare you can't wake up from, and Jacob was about to learn that the hard way. Hearing something to his right, he instinctively turned, and immediately wished that he had not. It took him maybe a half-second to turn his head, but he would have given anything in the world to have that half-second back, because it was the last moment that his world would ever seem normal again. In that split second, his world changed. It was no longer a place where the world was light and safe, where he was just a husband, and a father, and a guy that liked to hunt, and watch football on the weekends. That reality had evaporated away like early morning fog, and all that was left was a world where monsters existed, and things really went bump in the night. And now an ambassador from that nightmare realm was standing just outside his passenger door, a visible reminder that his world had been turned upside down. Jacob screamed as he stared transfixed on this escapee from a horror movie. In his most terrifying, fevered dream, he couldn't have imagined that such a thing could exist. It was hideously ugly, easily standing 8 feet tall, with a thick, muscular body. It looked very apish in appearance, but then again it didn't. There was just something about that face that was just wrong, almost like an obscene amalgamation of man and animal that had gone horribly awry. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. It was completely covered with thick shaggy black hair that was matted in areas with God only knows what, and it walked on 2 legs, not 4 like you would expect from some kind of animal. What was this thing that had shattered his perception of reality? Was it a demon? Was a werewolf? It can't be, he thought. Those things don't exist. Maybe it was some kind of reject from the island of Dr. Moreau. Whatever it was staring at him, and it did not look happy. The menacing juggernaut threw its enormous head back and let out a blood-curdling scream that resonated throughout the surrounding area and seemed to vibrate him to his very core. Shocked back into action, Jacob threw his truck into gear and took off as though he were being chased by the very hounds of hell. Jacob, mind racing, wondered what he was going to do. How will I ever feel safe on this farm again? He thought. Are my wife and children in danger? Where did this thing come from, and will anyone believe me? The whirlwind of thoughts that swirled through Jacob's mind came to an immediate stop as he slammed on his brakes and nearly slid off the road. In a state of disbelief, Jacob sat staring at the large hackberry tree that laid across the dirt road and blocked his path, preventing him from reaching the blacktop and guaranteed safety. How is this even possible? He thought. I just came down this road not even 30 minutes ago, and this path was clear. However, this tree came to be across the road. It was painfully obvious to Jacob that he had to get that tree moved if he was going to make it home. Since he had neither chain to pull the tree out of the road, nor did he have a saw with which he could cut up this unexpected barricade, he was left with few viable options, one of which was walking, which he discounted almost immediately. The most logical course of action that he could come up with was to call for help. His best friend Kenny Patterson owned the farm just over from his. If he were home, he could bring a saw and cut the tree up for him. Jacob, with his nerves still frazzled and frayed, reached into his glove box and pulled out his cell phone and clumsily dialed Kenny's number. The phone rang 6 times and Jacob was about to give up when Kenny answered the phone and said, "Hey, ugly, what do you want this early in the morning?" As quickly as he could, he related the recent events to Kenny and said, "Man, please hurry, I'm not kidding, there is something out here." Kenny, hearing the shakiness in his friend's voice, assured him that he would be there in a matter of minutes. Jacob thanked him and hung up the phone, and braced himself for what he was sure would be the longest few minutes of his life. Sitting motionless with bated breath there in the truck, every sound made his imagination run wild with fear and expectance. Even though little more than 3 minutes had passed since he had spoken to Kenny, it felt as if hours had passed. Each tick of the clock seemed to be an eternity. Jacob frequently checked in all directions for any sign that nightmarish monstrosity had pursued him. In every shadow that the forest, and this irritatingly cloudy day produced, he thought he saw the shape of the black beast that had followed him out of the woods, and he was afraid that he would lose his sanity long before Kenny arrived to clear the tree out of his pathway. After what seemed like a lifetime, Jacob heard the sound of Kenny's old truck sputtering up the road, and in just moments he was able to see the old red Chevrolet as it made its way closer to him. Jacob's spirits lifted when he saw his old friend, and a sense of relief washed over him as he realized that he was no longer alone. Stepping out of his truck, Jacob said, "Man, what took you so long? I asked you to hurry." Kenny, with an indignant look on his face, said, "What are you talking about? You only called me 11 minutes ago. I think I made pretty good time." Jacob could hardly believe that only 11 minutes had passed. It had seemed so much longer. After apologizing to his friend, and telling him exactly how happy he was to see him, both men walked over to the fallen tree, and made a discovery that startled them both. The tree had not broken, it had not been cut, it had been pushed over and completely uprooted. All around the tree were large, bipedal footprints that had a somewhat human appearance to them, but if they were human, the owner would require a size 28 shoe. Jacob and Kenny looked at each other, and then without a word went to work on the tree. Kenny took a Husqvarna chainsaw from the bed of his truck and began to cut up the fallen blockade. Meanwhile, Jacob pulled the logs and debris from the road. Mission accomplished. Kenny put away his saw and he and Jacob were about to get in their vehicles and leave. But before either man had even opened their doors, an ear-splitting scream, that would have filled a banshee with paralyzing fear, erupted from the woods behind them. Warily Jacob walked over to Kenny and whispered, "That's what I was telling you about. I don't know what that thing is, man, but it looks like some kind of monster. And I think we need to get out of here, now." Kenny, who looked as though the blood had drained completely out of his face, became very pale as he said to Jacob, "Jacob man, I've never mentioned this to anyone before now, but over the last few months that thing has been killing off a few of my cows. Their throats are usually torn out, and the bodies are mangled and broken. I didn't want anyone to accuse me of being crazy and making stuff up, so I never said anything about it. But that's the reason I rushed over when you called. I've heard that sound a few times off in the distance at night, but never this close, so I think you are right, old buddy, it's time to go." Cautiously and with a sense of urgency, Jacob and Kenny climbed into their vehicles and expeditiously made their way back to the blacktop. Turning left, both vehicles began the 2.5-mile trek that led back to Jacob's house so they could decide what course of action should be taken. Jacob could feel the temperature drop as snow began to gently fall. He reached over and turned his wipers on as snow began to pelt the windshield harder. As he passed his neighbor, William Springer's farm, he noticed a herd of deer grazing in the field that bordered his own property. Having put a bit of distance between himself and the nightmare he had just encountered, Jacob felt a renewed sense of security as his fatigued nerves began to calm. Not willing to let this opportunity pass him by, Jacob turned on his hazard lights and pulled to the shoulder of the road, and signaled Kenny to do the same. Kenny instinctively knew what Jacob was thinking as pulled in behind him, and turned his ignition off. Getting out of his truck, Kenny said, "What are you doing? Man, we need to get out of here, now." Jacob said, I know, and we will in just a minute, man, I just can't turn this down, man. I have to take the shot that is a 6-point buck standing there. It's not the trophy that I wanted, but at least I won't go home empty-handed, and after the morning we've had I think we deserve a little something good. Alright, just take the shot so we can go. I still don't feel right about this, Kenny said. Steadying his rifle across the hood of his truck, Jacob zeroed in on the buck and prepared to fire. That's when he heard Kenny make a gasping noise and whisper, "Oh my God. What is it, man? What's wrong with you? Raise your scope 3 inches, he said. Raising the scope, Jacob immediately saw what had been the cause of Kenny's alarm. Standing just outside the tree line in the edge of the field was the creature that they had left behind, not even 5 minutes. Was this thing following them? Was it after the deer? What was it doing? Jacob watched the creature through his scope for a full 30 seconds before it ever moved, and when it did, it ignored him and the deer and started to lope off toward William's barn that was just about 500 yards from where the woodland demon had been standing. Jacob called out to Kenny and said, "Kenny, call William and tell him there is something trying to get in his barn. I know he has at least 2 mares with foals in there, and if that thing gets in it will kill all of them." In an attempt to be rid of this monster, werewolf, Sasquatch, Wendigo, or whatever it was, Jacob fired a shot but missed. The creature turned in their direction and glared at them through red hate-filled eyes, and then began to run toward them at full steam. Kenny, who was still on the phone with William, screamed at Jacob to get in his truck and go. Jacob did as he was told, and Kenny followed suit. Starting their trucks, Jacob and Kenny both raced to Jacob's house as though they were driving on the NASCAR circuit. Arriving at home, Jacob, gun in hand, ran inside to get a phone book so that they could call the game warden and the police and get some kind of animal control out there to get rid of this thing. Jacob had just stepped out on his front porch when they heard gunfire coming from over at William's place. Dropping the phone book and running back inside, Jacob grabbed his 12-gauge pump shotgun and some shells and handed them to Kenny, who took little time in loading it. Jacob and Kenny, now locked and loaded, walked together to Kenny's truck, preparing to mount up a rescue for their neighbor William. Simultaneously, both of them stopped in their tracks as an uneasy but familiar feeling crept over them, and Jacob's Rottweiler and 2 German Shepherds began to whimper, and ran under the front porch to hide. Kenny, whose throat had suddenly gone dry as a bone, whispered to Jacob and said, "I have a really bad feeling about this." No sooner had the words escaped his lips, they heard a deafening scream erupted from the forest off to their right, and the creature exploded from the trees in front of them. Until now, neither man had been able to fully appreciate the colossal size and scope of the beast, but standing less than 30 feet away they were almost overcome by the sheer magnitude of it. Jacob had seen it up close earlier from his truck while sitting down, and had guessed the height at maybe 8 feet, but now standing looking up he could tell that this fellow was 8.5 or 9 feet tall, and would tip the scale at 800 to 1,000 pounds. It had inhumanly long arms that bulged with the cropy muscle, that were easily seen beneath its long shaggy black hair, which covered it from head to toe. The chest was larger than a 55-gallon drum, and there was little doubt that it could have pulled the arms off an ape, and now it glared at them with malevolent intent. Jacob and Kenny both opened fire without hesitation. The creature screamed with rage as the bullets tore into its massive body, knocking it to the ground, but not killing or seriously injuring it. Jacob and Kenny watched speechless as it crawled into the tree line, struggled to its feet and limped away. Jacob ran back to the porch and grabbed the phone book, and called the local game warden. Nearly 2 hours later, Gene Trauber, the local warden, showed up to take their statements, and told them that he had been called out to answer numerous such reports in the area, but he wasn't sure what to make of all these reports. "Guys," he said, "I don't know what to tell you. There is no animal in this area, or any area for that matter, that fits your description. I'm not saying I don't believe you, I just don't know what it is." Jacob, whose face was reddened with anger, said, "Come here. Here is the blood from where we shot it, and here are the footprints." A look of complete confusion washed over Gene's face, and he asked if they would care to go with him as he tried to track it. Jacob and Kenny agreed, but they said they weren't going without a gun. Gene stated that he planned to take his gun as well. All 3 men loaded their guns, and set out following the deeply impressed tracks and droplets of blood that had fallen on the withered leaves. They followed the trail for about a mile until arriving at a creek that was located deep in Jacob's woods, where the tracks that they were following were joined by others just like them. Some were smaller, but at least one set was larger. Deciding that the safest course of action would be to return home, they all went back to Jacob's. None of them relished the idea of staying out in the woods longer, since there was now apparently more than one creature, and the cloudy overcast day made the forest seem even darker than it would normally be this time of day. Back at Jacob's, Gene informed them that there was nothing left that he could do but file it under an unknown animal sighting, which made both Kenny and Jacob anything but happy. Jacob and Kenny spent the next couple of days trying to warn their neighbors to use caution when they were out in the forest. Most of their friends just laughed at them and said they had probably seen a bear, or something. No one believed them except William, who had seen it himself the same day they had. He had even taken a shot at it, but missed. Jacob, William, and Kenny knew what they had seen, and they knew it was still out there, and they didn't care who believed them, and who didn't. Over the next few weeks, more and more neighbors began to take the story a little more seriously, as family pets began to disappear, and others were found brutally mangled. Other farms in the area began to find their cows and other livestock torn open with their throats ripped out. Just a week after shooting the creature in his yard, Jacob's own Rottweiler was found dead with its throat torn out, hanging across a limb in a tree in his front yard. It almost seemed like a revenge killing. A few days later, one of William's new foals died the same way. The foal's mother had to be put to sleep, because she had gone into shock over whatever she had witnessed there in the barn when her foal was killed. Some people in the area still don't believe. They think the whole story was made up. But Jacob and Kenny know that there is still something out there in the forest. They still occasionally find tracks, or a slaughtered cow, or goat. They still hear the blood-curdling screams off in the woods at night. They know that there is still something out there watching and waiting, biding its time. Something cold, and cunning, and cruel, something not human with a taste for blood and revenge.